not to the federal government of Canada because it is easier. That is a damning statement. It is important to understand that context. It is important to understand that other jurisdictions are doing procurement better than we are. That needs immediate change. That needs foundational changes. And so I'm pleased to be with you today to announce that we are publishing a report on solutions. Those solutions address the 5 foundational changes that are necessary in federal procurement. Why it's important coming from us. We offer an honest, independent viewpoint. We don't sit inside federal bureaucracy. We don't work to Parliament. We absolutely do all aspects of our work absolutely independently. So the first change I want to highlight is that of the creation of a Chief Procurement Officer. Now I understand that that may result in a bit of an eye roll because you think, hey, the answer to every government problem is not creating a new position or creating additional layers of bureaucracy. But one of the things we have noted is the lack of accountability in federal procurement. So ultimately, who will be accountable for ushering us through this important period of change? And that person has to be the Chief Procurement Officer. This position has to be created at the highest level of Top 10 list of procurement issues that we see across a variety of stakeholders. Those stakeholders include suppliers, federal buyers, the general public, politicians. And there is a certain static, repetitive nature of those top 10 issues. And so at a certain point, we looked at ourselves and said, what are we doing as an office to make those improvements ourselves? And you might have heard me say that Band-Aid solutions are not enough. And many of the recommendations that we were making while addressing specific issues within the existing system were just that, Band-Aid solutions. And we can no longer sustain Band-Aid solutions. We have to address the foundational issue that our system is too complex and it's not working for all participants. The CPO will be charged with the responsibility of ushering us through that change. Nous avons constaté cela dans plusieurs de nos récents examens des pratiques d'approvisionnement et c'était très évident que personne n'était vraiment responsable des problèmes qui ont apparu. So the reason for the lack of accountability is the bifurcated nature of the federal procurement system. Having someone who sits atop the system with those responsibilities specifically identified is critical to the success. And that's why I talk about it first, because this position will ultimately be responsible for implementation of the subsequent issues that I'm going to be addressing. The second one is vendor performance management. So I apologize to those of you who have heard me speak in the past because this is something I've been speaking about for years. And I really hope the attention is now. Vendor performance management is something so basic that the average Canadian understands the concept. If you were to hire a plumber to fix a leak in your kitchen, and that plumber arrived 2 hours late and brought the wrong tools, what are the chances that that average Canadian is going to be using that plumber in a subsequent need? The answer is they're not, right? That's a simple decision that the Canadian taxpayer is able to make. Now, in the federal procurement context, the problem is even more acute than that. And I'll play it out in 2 scenarios. One, a supplier, poor performing, works for a specific department within the federal government. That performance is noted as poor. However, there's nowhere to go with that information. It doesn't give rise to a termination of the contract, but it's so bad that the services or the good that were provided were ultimately not for the intended purpose. That same supplier goes to a different department and is able to sell those same services and same good without any ramification of that poor performance with that first department, right? So that's a pretty damning scenario. But a second scenario that I would highlight is within the same department, that same vendor continues to sell those services and the same good. Now, within that department, individuals speak to one another and highlight the fact that this is a known poor performer. So that group of people who are charged with the new acquisition process ask themselves, what can be done within the existing rules? Because ultimately people want to follow the rules, but more importantly, don't want to waste taxpayer funds. So they look at the rules that are available to them and realize there are no great rules that will allow them to do what they want to do. So they create restrictive criteria to ensure that the participation of that poor performer is not available. But as a byproduct of that decision, what ends up happening is additional measures to other viable Canadian suppliers. So those Canadian suppliers are not eligible to participate in that process, right? And that limits competition and it has a dramatic impact. Another thing you've heard me talk about is documentation. If you haven't followed the rules, what do you think the chances are that you're going to document the fact that you haven't followed those rules? Again, chances are you're not going to document that decision. Therefore, documentation is, again, a byproduct of no VPM. So I implore everyone to highlight this need. This is a missing puzzle piece. Now, I must say, PSPC is making progress in this regard. They have a pilot project that we are looking at very optimistically in hopes that it is the building block upon which it will grow into a government-wide solution. But having an initial level pilot project is not sufficient. And again, back to accountability. Who is accountable to ensure that this is stood up in a timely manner? So that's issue number 2. Number 3 is the rule set. So going back to my comment about complexity, the rules drive the complexity. Most jurisdictions have federal procurement either at the statutory or regulatory level. Every stakeholder we speak to in the procurement space, whether they be buyers or suppliers, struggle to understand the applicable rule set. And the reason is there's multiple sources for the rules, none of which is particularly authoritative. You have free trade agreements that apply in certain circumstances. You have a statute, the Financial Administration Act, that makes cursory mention to federal procurement, fair, open, and transparent. You have a regulation, the government contracting regulation, that says you must compete unless certain exceptions are met. But beyond that, no specific rules are provided. One level below, you have the Directive on the Management of Procurement, a principles-based directive, which requires the creation of a framework by departments. Those frameworks include underlying policies. Those underlying departmental specific policies include guidelines, instructions. So if you can see the broadening, the apex of the triangle, which is the statute, is very narrow and a very broad base, meaning what is ultimately authoritative is very thin. We're suggesting look at other jurisdictions who do this differently. They have a strong federal procurement system created by way of statute or regulation. There are multiple multiple jurisdictions cited in our report. I would encourage all of you to look at those jurisdictions because, like I mentioned, if Canadian suppliers are looking at other jurisdictions because it's easier, why, as the federal government, are we not also looking to those other jurisdictions to improve where we can? And again, I'm not suggesting that there's a magic answer, right? There is no solution that's going to solve all procurement issues, but we need to work towards modernizing the system. Continually working within the existing framework is simply not working. And the last thing I'll say on this point is, part of where our frustration came from was the acknowledgement that these issues have existed well beyond my tenure. I've been the procurement ombud for 7.5 years. My commitment was not at the last day, on my last day of my term, was I going to issue a scathing report saying how federal procurement was broken. If I wanted to do my job effectively and leave procurement in a better place, I had to stand up and speak the truth. And the truth is the system needs to be overhauled. And that's really the importance of today. The fourth change is AI. I'm not sure how much time I need to spend on AI, simply to say that if we're constructing a new design for a federal procurement process, we need to acknowledge that AI is already being used by suppliers. Suppliers are using AI to actually create bids. So if we're not incorporating AI as part of our methodology to help us become more efficient and effective in doing federal procurement, again, we risk being left behind. So it is absolutely essential. One thing that AI can help us do, and this will be particularly interesting for those in the room, is data, right? I'm sure many of you try to report accurately on procurement issues. Some of you contact our office seeking to validate the information that you're seeing online, made transparent by the federal government, to validate whether it's accurate or not. And accuracy is critical in data. And so how can you effectively do your jobs as reporters and provide information to the Canadian public if you don't have accurate data? So our fifth foundational change is create a robust framework for data to ensure, specific to procurement, to ensure that it is searchable, accurate, and timely. And without those, even having an AI tool that searches the existing data set, while it does address one problem, which is the human hours necessary to search all of the various data sources to create a storyline that you believe is accurate, but ultimately are unsure, right? And we've seen through our own reports that the accuracy of that data is questionable. Sometimes the applicable rules are wrong, sometimes the value of the contract is wrong, sometimes it's not made available at all, or it's not made available in a timely manner. So the fact that data needs to be presented in a different manner is absolutely necessary. Even with the incorporation of AI, that doesn't necessarily fix the problem associated with data. So where does that leave us? So both David and myself, the Deputy Procurement Ombud, have met with both ministers, Minister Lightbound and Minister Fuhr, who have an issue with transformation on their laps. And they are both very keen to better understand our perspectives, and they were both willingly wanting to participate in an ongoing dialogue with our office to ensure that the transformational issues that we described in the report are well thought through, well addressed by whatever happens next. So I leave it there, and I encourage questions in terms of how we get to that next step. And the last thought I will simply say is that we have to seize the opportunity. So everyone now is talking about transformation. There's seemingly an acknowledgement that the system is not working effectively. If we do not act now, I fear that I could be before you in 2 years' time at the end of my mandate saying the same things. And to be honest, I can't. It's a failure of the system if that's the situation. So it's incumbent on everyone involved in federal procurement to take all of the issues we know to exist and start implementing solutions that will adequately address them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, we'll now go to questions. I asked my colleagues on Zoom, should we have the time and you wish to ask a question, please use the raise hand function and I will call on you then. For now, we will start with Bill Curry with the Globe and Mail.
Good morning. Yesterday, the finance minister asked all ministers to try to find internal savings, and all political parties in the last election said that contracting, outsourcing is an area where there's money to be found there. This is your world. In your time reviewing the way Ottawa spends on contracts, is there a lot of wasteful spending? Is there a lot of savings to be found, or is this running well?
So I can only answer in the areas that we have done reviews, right? And we've certainly seen issues associated with service contracts. And so associated with those issues, there's cost savings to be had. There are changes that have been recently announced by the department that we're looking at optimistically, as I recently mentioned, for how effective those changes will be in reducing the amount of spending and waste. However, the hypothesis around whether in fact there is additional waste to be recaptured by having a more efficient and robust oversight system, we absolutely support that notion, particularly in contract administration, and that's something that we're looking to have a more strengthened lens to look at that issue specifically. And by that I mean, when the contract is awarded, there's a lot of transparency around it, and that's typically where the media attention goes, process where it's just between the parties to the contract. And there are things happening in contract administration that give us cause for concern, and we want to ensure that we do accrue those efficiencies that are negotiated and specifically contemplated in the award process, that they materialize in the contract administration phase.
And my next question, you mentioned poor performers, and I'd like to get your sense as to how far that goes, because there is, as an example, there's a case where the federal government is pursuing one contractor and subcontractor where the billing was more than 24 hours a day. You know, there's those kinds of allegations of outright fraud. In your view, is that kind of poor performance common?
So again, it's too early for me to answer a question about the quantum or how often this is happening, because again, what we note is there isn't a system to accurately capture that picture for you to directly answer your question. That being said, we know that there are poor performers who continue to get government contracts. We hear that information from government buyers. Government buyers are asking for a VPM system so that information can be shared openly and transparently. But without a process, how does one share that information about poor performance so it actually has an impact on future contracts that are awarded by the federal government? So to answer your question, what we hear is certainly, yes, there are poor performers in the system. There is a financial cost to that poor performance, and there aren't the tools available yet to address that poor performance.
Next, we'll go to Estelle with Radio-Canada.
Bonjour. Dans tous les problèmes que vous avez vus jusqu'à maintenant, est-ce qu'il y en a un qui vous a frappé davantage et qu'on devrait éviter dans le futur? Est-ce que c'est possible de donner un exemple de quelque chose qui vous a vraiment frappé et qu'on devrait éviter?
Oui. Donc, les critères trop restrictifs, c'est une chose qu'on voit tous les jours. C'était le premier enjeu qu'on voit pendant les derniers 5 ans. Donc, c'est quelque chose que je parlais à propos de la VPM. J'ai dit, il y a une solution qui dit si on crée des critères trop restrictifs, on diminue la chance que cet fournisseur qui a une mauvaise performance peut gagner un contrat. Mais on voit qu'il y a beaucoup de fournisseurs canadiens qui ne peuvent pas gagner le contrat à cause que cet critère est trop restrictif. Donc, il y a beaucoup d'exemples, des circonstances qu'on a vues que des critères restrictifs ont un outcome négatif. Right? Ça diminue la compétition entre les fournisseurs canadiens et ça diminue la tension monétaire pour le gouvernement. Donc, on peut payer trop à cause qu'on a une diminution de compétition.
Puis, il y a certains des changements que vous réclamez qui sont des changements de longue date que vous demandez. Qu'est-ce qu'on vous dit? Qu'est-ce qu'on vous donne comme explication pour justifier le fait que ces changements-là ne sont pas mis en place?
Oui.
Quelle réponse vous donne-t-on?
Donc, comme j'ai mentionné avec le VPM, on a eu des exemples comme PSPC qui démontrent qu'il fait un effort pour changer et régler le problème qui est qu'ils ont un projet pilote. Mais c'est 7 ans que je suis dans ce rôle et dans 7 ans, on n'a pas avancé assez. Donc, c'est pour ça que je dis c'est nécessaire d'avoir une position comme le CPO qui va être responsable pour l'implémentation de tous les problèmes. Donc, juste avoir un projet pilote, c'est pas assez. On doit assurer que ce projet pilote devienne quelque chose qui est pas pilote dans le ministère, qui devient nécessaire et mandaté à propos de tous les ministères du gouvernement fédéral. Merci.
Laura.
Hey there, Laura Osman with The Logic. Are you advocating when it comes to artificial intelligence something that would be involved in the decision-making process? Because we know, of course, that procurement is also a subjective process.
Right.
And so what are your cautions and what are you advocating for?
Right. So at this point, I think it would be premature to actually allow decisions to be contemplated through AI tools. At this point, it's more the creation of the scope of work, the creation of the criteria, where you're taking an amalgamation of existing data and using best practices. And again, it should require oversight, right? At this point, I don't think the AI tool is to replace the human interaction in the procurement process, but it's to make it more efficient. So the time associated with the creation of a scope of work could go from several hours to several minutes, right? And so if you extrapolate those efficiencies across the system, those are significant savings. Now, those human elements can be used in higher level complexity work, but we're not there yet. But that's not to say that we shouldn't probe to see if at some point we get there, right? So we're not there yet, but let's see how the AI tool develops to allow for the most efficient use. And again, the comparative jurisdictional analysis is absolutely necessary. We cannot fall behind in our attempt to modernize Canadian federal procurement.
Thank you. On the idea of a chief procurement officer, why should that ultimately accountable person not be the minister themselves or their DM?
So the realities are the minister is pulled in several directions all the time. So absolutely, they should have ultimate responsibility. But what we have seen in the past in mandate letters, that there has been transparency